Margaret Chen woke up that Tuesday morning just like every other morning for the past 3 years. She opened her eyes at exactly 6:30 and looked at the white ceiling of her small room at Sunset Gardens Assisted Living. The morning light came through her window and made patterns on the wall that she had memorized by now. She slowly sat up in her bed and reached for her glasses on the nightstand. Everything was the same as always. She got dressed in her usual clothes, which were a simple blue sweater and dark pants. Margaret was 92 years old and had been living at Sunset Gardens since her youngest daughter Sarah had convinced her to move there. Sarah worried that Margaret was getting too old to live alone in her apartment. Margaret did not want to move, but she also did not want to be a burden on her children. So she agreed to come to this place where old people lived. Together, and nurses took care of them after breakfast in the dining room. Margaret walked slowly to her favorite chair by the window in the main hall. She used her walker to help her move around because her legs were not as strong as they used to be. The walker made a clicking sound on the floor as she walked. Margaret liked to sit by the window and watch the birds outside. There were always sparrows and sometimes a red cardinal that made her smile, but today was different. When Margaret entered the main hall, she saw something that made her stop walking. There in the center of the room was a large black piano. It was a baby grand piano, and it looked very old but still beautiful. Margaret had not seen a piano this close for many, many years. Her heart started beating faster, and she felt something strange in her chest. The activity director, Jenny, was there too. Jenny was a young woman with bright red hair who always tried to make the old people happy with games and singing. Jenny was talking to some of the other residents and explaining that today they would have something called Music Appreciation Hour. She said they had borrowed the piano from a music school that was closing down. The school had donated it to Sunset Gardens so the residents could enjoy music. Margaret could not take her eyes off the piano. She stood there holding her walker and staring at the instrument. Other residents were gathering around and sitting in their wheelchairs and folding chairs. Mrs. Rodriguez was there with her knitting. Mr. Thompson was there with his newspaper. Mrs. Johnson was there with her cat-stuffed animal that she carried. Everywhere they were all talking and laughing about the piano, but Margaret was quiet. Jenny noticed that. Margaret was standing there looking at the piano with a very serious expression. Jenny walked over to Margaret and smiled. She said hello and asked if Margaret liked music. Margaret nodded but did not say anything. Jenny thought maybe Margaret was shy or maybe she did not hear well. Many of the residents had trouble hearing. More people came into the hall. Some were residents and some were staff members and some were family members who were visiting. Everyone was curious about the piano. Some people were taking pictures with their phones. The piano was definitely the most exciting thing that had happened at Sunset Gardens in a long time. Margaret slowly walked closer to the piano. Her walker made its clicking sound, but she did not notice. She was thinking about something far away and long ago. As she got closer, she could see the keys. They were white and black, just like she remembered. Some of the white keys were a little yellow from age, but they still looked beautiful to her. She reached out her hand and touched the edge of the piano. The wood felt smooth and cool. Margaret had not touched a piano for over 40 years. The last time was when she had to sell her own piano to pay for her husband Robert's medical bills. That was so long ago that sometimes she wondered if she had imagined that she ever had a piano at all. But now with her hand on this piano, she remembered everything. She remembered sitting at her piano in her small apartment and playing late at night when the children were asleep. She remembered how the music made her feel like she could fly. She remembered how her fingers knew exactly where to go on the keys without her even thinking about it. Jenny saw Margaret touching the piano and came over again. She asked Margaret if she knew how to play piano. Margaret looked at Jenny, and for the first time in a long time she smiled a real smile. Not the polite smile she gave to the nurses or the sad smile she gave to her daughter Sarah when she visited. This was a different kind of smile, Margaret said. Yes, she used to play piano a very long time ago. Jenny got excited and asked if Margaret would like to try playing something for everyone. Margaret felt scared and excited at the same time. She had not played piano for so long that she was not sure if she remembered how. What if she tried to play and no music came out? What if everyone laughed at her, but something inside Margaret was waking up? It was like a fire that had been sleeping for 40 years was starting to burn again. She looked at all the faces of the people who were watching her. They looked kind and interested. Even Mr. Thompson had put down his newspaper and was looking at her with curious eyes. Margaret nodded and said she would try to play something simple. Jenny helped her sit down on the piano bench. The bench was the right height and felt comfortable. Margaret put her hands on the keys and closed her eyes. She took a deep breath and tried to remember what it felt like to play piano. When she opened her eyes, she looked down at her hands. They were old hands now with wrinkles and spots. These hands had washed dishes and changed diapers and worked in factories and done so many things over the years. But maybe these hands still remembered how to make music. The room became very quiet. Everyone was watching Margaret and waiting to see what would happen. Margaret felt nervous but also excited. She was about to find out if the music was still inside her after all these years. Margaret sat at the piano bench and felt the smooth wood under her fingers. The keys were cool to touch and brought back memories she had buried deep in her mind. She pressed one key very gently and heard a soft note fill the quiet room. The sound was beautiful and clear. It made her remember things she had tried to forget for so many years. Jenny stood beside her and spoke in a gentle voice. She told Margaret to take her time and play whatever felt right. There was no pressure and no hurry. The other residents were sitting quietly and waiting. Margaret could feel their eyes on her, but she was not thinking about them anymore. She was thinking about a little girl who lived far away and long ago. That little girl was her. Margaret was born in Shanghai, China in 1931. Her father was a businessman who worked with foreign companies. Her mother was a teacher who loved music very much. When Margaret was only 4 years old, her mother noticed that she could sing any song perfectly after hearing it just once. Her mother was amazed and decided to get Margaret piano lessons. Margaret's first piano teacher was a Chinese woman named Mrs. Liu, who had studied music in Europe. Mrs. Liu was very strict but also very kind. She taught Margaret how to sit properly at the piano and how to hold her hands. Margaret learned quickly, and Mrs. Liu said she had never seen a child with such natural talent. By the time Margaret was 6 years old, she was playing pieces that most children could not play until they were much older. Her parents were proud but also worried. They knew that being too different could be dangerous in those days. But Margaret loved music more than anything else in the world. When she played piano, she felt like she was flying. Margaret pressed another key on the piano at Sunset Gardens. This time it was a different note, and it reminded her of her second piano teacher. When she was 8 years old, her parents hired a man from Germany named Mr. Heinrich. He was very tall and had a big mustache. Mr. Heinrich had studied at the best music schools in Europe, and he taught Margaret things that Mrs. Liu could not teach her. Mr. Heinrich was amazed by Margaret's ability. He said she was what people called a prodigy. That meant she was born with a special gift for music. He taught her to play pieces by famous composers like Bach and Mozart and Chopin. Margaret's fingers were small, but they were very strong and fast. She could play the most difficult pieces without making mistakes. Margaret's parents were happy, but also scared. China was becoming a dangerous place in the 1930s. There were wars and fighting, and life was getting harder for everyone. Margaret's father knew that they might have to leave Shanghai someday, but Margaret did not think about these things. She only thought about music. When Margaret was 10 years old, she gave her first public performance. It was at a concert hall in Shanghai, and many important people came to hear her play. She wore a white dress that her mother had made for her, and she played a piece by Chopin that was very difficult. When she finished playing, everyone stood up and clapped for a long time. Margaret felt like the happiest person in the world, but the happy times did not last long. When Margaret was 14 years old, the fighting in China got worse. Her father decided that the family had to leave Shanghai and go to America. Margaret was heartbroken because she had to leave her piano behind. It was too big and too expensive to take with them on the ship. Margaret touched more keys on the piano at Sunset Gardens. Each note brought back more memories. She remembered the long journey across the ocean to America. She remembered arriving in San Francisco and feeling scared and confused. Everything was different in America. The language was different, and the food was different, and the people were different. Margaret's family had very little money when they arrived in America. Her father could not find work that paid well because he did not speak English perfectly. Her mother got a job cleaning houses for rich people. Margaret wanted to continue her piano lessons, but there was no money for that. The family needed every penny just to buy food and pay rent. Margaret had to go to an American school where she did not understand what the teachers were saying. The other children laughed at her because she looked different and spoke with an accent. Margaret felt lonely and sad. At night she would lie in bed and move her fingers like she was playing piano. But there was no piano to play. When Margaret was 16 years old, she got a job in a factory that made clothes. She worked long hours and her hands got rough and sore. The beautiful music that used to fill her head became quieter and quieter. She was too tired to think about piano when she came home from work. Then Margaret met Robert Chun. He was a young man who also worked at the factory. He was Chinese American and he was very kind to Margaret. He helped her learn English and he made her laugh when she was sad. They fell in love and got married when Margaret was 19 years old. Margaret and Robert had 5 children together. Margaret loved her children very much, but raising them was hard work. Robert worked 2 jobs to support the family and Margaret stayed home to take care of the babies. There was no time for music and no money for a piano. Sometimes Margaret would go to the local church and listen to the choir practice. The music made her heart happy but also sad. She remembered how it felt to make music with her own hands. But that life seemed like a dream now. She was a mother and a wife, and that was her life. When Margaret was 35 years old, she finally saved enough money to buy a small used piano. She put it in the corner of their tiny apartment and started playing again. Her fingers were stiff at first, but slowly they remembered what to do. Her children loved to hear her play, and they would dance around the room while she made music. But when Robert got sick with cancer, the family needed money for his medical bills. Margaret had to make a terrible choice. She sold her piano to pay for Robert's medicine. Robert died anyway, and Margaret never bought another piano. She pushed her music deep down inside her heart and tried to forget about it. Now, Margaret was sitting at this piano at Sunset Gardens, and all those memories were coming back. Her fingers were touching the keys and her heart was beating fast. She wondered if she still remembered how to play after all these years. Margaret sat at the piano bench and felt all the memories rushing through her mind like a river. She looked down at her hands and saw how old they had become. These hands had once been young and strong and had made beautiful music. Now they were wrinkled and spotted with age. Her fingers felt stiff, and she wondered if they would remember what to do. Jenny was still standing beside her, and she could see that Margaret was thinking about something very deep. Jenny did not want to rush her. But she also noticed that more people were coming into the hall. Word had spread around Sunset Gardens that Margaret was going to play the piano. This was very unusual because most of the residents just listened to music, but they never played instruments. Mrs. Rodriguez had put down her knitting and was looking at Margaret with curious eyes. Mr. Thompson had folded his newspaper and was paying attention for the first time in weeks. Mrs. Johnson was holding her stuffed cat and whispering to it about the piano. Even some of the nurses and staff members were coming in to see what was happening. Margaret heard footsteps and voices behind her, but she did not turn around. She was trying to remember the feeling of playing piano. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine the music flowing from her fingers to the keys. It had been so long since she had played that she was not sure if she could do it anymore. Jenny noticed that Margaret seemed nervous, so she gently put her hand on Margaret's shoulder. She told Margaret that it was okay if she did not want to play. There was no pressure and everyone would understand. But Margaret shook her head and said she wanted to try. Something inside her was telling her that this was important. This might be her last chance to play piano. More people kept coming into the hall. Some were residents who had heard about the piano from their friends. Some were staff members who were on their break. Some were family members who had come to visit their loved ones and heard about what was happening. The room was getting fuller and fuller. Margaret could hear people talking quietly behind her. They were wondering if she really knew how to play piano. Some of them had lived at Sunset Gardens for years, and they had never heard Margaret talk about music. She was always quiet and kept to herself. Nobody knew about her past or her secret talent. A young man with a beard came into the hall. He was visiting his grandmother, Mrs. Patterson, who lived on the third floor. He had his phone in his hand, and he was curious about why so many people were gathered around the piano. Mrs. Patterson whispered to him that Margaret was going to play something. The young man had never seen so much excitement at the assisted living home. Margaret opened her eyes and looked at the keys again. She remembered her first piano teacher, Mrs. Liu, telling her to always start with scales. Scales were like exercises for the fingers, and they helped warm up the muscles. Margaret decided to start with a simple scale to see if her fingers still worked. She placed her right hand on the keys and found the note called middle C. This was the note that all piano players learned first. It was like the center of the piano keyboard. Margaret pressed the key and heard the clear sound. Then she played the next note and the next note. She was playing a C major scale just like Mrs. Liu had taught her over 80 years ago. The room became very quiet. Everyone was listening to Margaret play the simple scale. Her fingers were slow at first, but they seemed to remember where to go. She played up the scale and then back down. The notes were clear and beautiful. Some people in the room had never heard a piano played this close before. Margaret felt a warm feeling in her chest. Her fingers were starting to remember what to do. She played the scale again, and this time it was a little faster and smoother. She could feel the music waking up inside her after sleeping for so many years. It was like finding an old friend that she had lost. Jenny smiled and whispered to Margaret that she was doing wonderful. Margaret nodded and decided to try something a little harder. She remembered a simple piece by Bach that she had learned when she was very young. It was called a minuet, and it was gentle and pretty. Margaret put both hands on the keys and began to play. The music that came from the piano was beautiful. Margaret's fingers moved across the keys like they were dancing. The notes flowed together and created a melody that made everyone in the room feel peaceful and happy. Even though Margaret had not played piano for 40 years, her fingers seemed to know exactly what to do. Mr. Thompson leaned forward in his chair and listened carefully. He had always loved classical music, but he had never heard anyone play piano this well in person. Mrs. Rodriguez stopped thinking about her knitting and just enjoyed the beautiful sounds. Mrs. Johnson hugged her stuffed cat and smiled. Margaret finished the Bach piece and felt confident enough to try something harder. She remembered a piece by Chopin that she had loved when she was young. It was more difficult than the Bach piece, but she decided to try it. Margaret took a deep breath and began to play. The music that came from the piano now was amazing. It was fast and complicated and full of emotion. Margaret's fingers flew across the keys like birds flying through the sky. The music was sometimes soft and gentle and sometimes loud and powerful. Everyone in the room was surprised by how beautiful it sounded. The young man with the beard realized that he was watching something very special. He quietly took out his phone and started recording. He did not want to disturb Margaret, but he wanted to capture this moment. Other people in the room had the same idea, and they also started recording with their phones. Margaret was completely lost in the music now. She forgot about the people watching her, and she forgot about being old and tired. She only thought about the music flowing through her fingers. She felt young again and strong again. She felt like the little girl in Shanghai, who had amazed everyone with her talent. The Chopin piece was difficult, but Margaret played it perfectly. When she finished, everyone in the room was silent for a moment. They could not believe what they had just heard. Then someone started clapping, and soon everyone was clapping and cheering. Margaret looked up and saw all the happy faces around her. She realized that something wonderful was happening. Margaret felt the energy from the applause fill her heart with joy. She had forgotten how wonderful it felt to make music and share it with other people. The clapping died down and everyone was looking at her with amazement. They wanted to hear more. Margaret realized that she was not finished yet. There was more music inside her that needed to come out. She looked down at her hands and saw that they were not shaking anymore. Her fingers felt strong and sure. The piano keys felt like old friends welcoming her home. Margaret decided to play something that she had always loved but had never been able to perform when she was young. It was a piece by Rachmaninoff that was very difficult and beautiful. Margaret placed her hands on the keys and began to play the opening notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. This was one of the most challenging pieces ever written for piano. Most professional pianists spent years learning to play it properly, but Margaret had always dreamed of playing it, and now she finally had her chance. The music that came from the piano was incredible. The melody was sad and beautiful at the same time. It told a story of love and loss and hope. Margaret's fingers moved across the keys with amazing speed and precision. The notes flowed like water and filled the room with rich harmonies that made everyone feel deep emotions. People in the room began to cry. The music was so beautiful that it touched their hearts in a way that nothing had for a long time. Mrs. Rodriguez had tears running down her cheeks. Mr. Thompson was wiping his eyes with his handkerchief. Even some of the young staff members were crying. Margaret was completely lost in the music. She felt like she was flying above the piano and looking down at her hands moving by themselves. The music was pouring out of her soul and through her fingers. She was no longer a 92-year-old woman in an assisted living home. She was pure music and pure joy. The young man with the beard was recording everything with his phone. He could not believe what he was seeing. His grandmother, Mrs. Patterson, was sitting next to him with her mouth open in amazement. She had lived at Sunset Gardens for 2 years and she had never seen anything like this. Nobody had ever told her that Margaret was a piano player. More people were still coming into the hall. The word had spread throughout the building that something amazing was happening. Nurses were leaving their stations to come and listen. Kitchen staff were taking breaks to hear the music. Even the director of Sunset Gardens had come downstairs to see what was causing all the excitement. Margaret finished the Rachmaninoff piece and immediately began playing something completely different. Without stopping, she moved into a piece by Chopin called the Revolutionary Etude. This piece was famous for being extremely difficult to play. It required the pianist to play very fast notes with the left hand while the right hand played a strong melody. The music was powerful and dramatic. It sounded like a storm with thunder and lightning. Margaret's left hand moved so fast that it looked like a blur. Her right hand played the melody with strength and passion. The combination was breathtaking. Everyone in the room was amazed that anyone could play piano this well, especially someone who was 92 years old. Margaret's body had changed while she was playing. She no longer looked like a tired old woman. Her back was straight and her shoulders were strong. Her face was bright with joy and energy. The music had transformed her into the young prodigy she had once been. The years had melted away and she was ageless. When Margaret finished the Chopin piece, she surprised everyone by starting to play jazz music. She began with a song called Body and Soul, but she played it in her own special way. She added her own notes and rhythms to make it sound new and exciting. Her fingers danced across the keys and created music that was both familiar and completely original. The jazz music was different from the classical pieces, but it was just as beautiful. Margaret showed that she was not just a classical pianist, but a complete musician who could play any style of music. She played the melody with her right hand and created a walking bass line with her left hand. The music swung and moved in a way that made people want to dance. Some of the staff members started swaying to the music. The young man with the beard was amazed by how versatile Margaret was. He had never heard anyone play classical music and jazz music so well in the same performance. He made sure his phone was capturing everything because he knew this was something special. Margaret moved from body and soul into other jazz standards. She played Summertime and Autumn Leaves and Take 5. Each song was different and showed another side of her musical talent. She played some songs fast and energetic and others slow and romantic. Her fingers knew exactly what to do for each style of music. The room was completely packed now. Word had spread beyond Sunset Gardens, and some people from the neighborhood had come to listen. Family members who lived nearby had rushed over after getting phone calls about Margaret's performance. Everyone was recording with their phones because they knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. Margaret played for almost 20 minutes without stopping. She moved from one piece to another like she was telling a story with music. Each song connected to the next one and created a journey through different emotions and memories. The audience was completely captivated and no one wanted her to stop. Finally, Margaret played one last piece. It was a song called "The Way You Look Tonight," and she played it very slowly and gently. Her fingers caressed the keys and created a sound. That was like a whisper. The music was tender and full of love. It was the perfect ending to an incredible performance. When Margaret played the final note, everyone in the room was silent for a moment. They had just witnessed something magical and they needed time to understand what had happened. Then the applause began. It was not just clapping, but shouting and cheering. People were standing up and crying and hugging each other. Margaret looked up at all the faces and saw pure joy and amazement. She had given them something beautiful that they would never forget. Margaret sat at the piano bench and looked out at all the faces staring back at her. The applause was still going on and people were wiping tears from their eyes. She felt like she was in a dream. Just an hour ago, she had been a quiet old woman that nobody really noticed. Now she was surrounded by people who were amazed by what they had just heard. Jenny came over to Margaret and helped her stand up from the piano bench. Jenny had tears in her eyes too, and she told Margaret that her performance was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. Margaret smiled and felt proud but also a little confused. She had not expected this reaction from people. She had just been playing music like she used to do many years ago. The young man with the beard came over to Margaret and introduced himself. His name was David, and he told her that he had recorded her entire performance on his phone. He asked if it would be okay to share the video with other people. Margaret was not sure what he meant, but she nodded and said yes. She did not understand how powerful the internet could be. David went home that night and uploaded the video to several social media websites. He wrote a caption that said, "92-year-old grandmother plays piano like a professional." He thought maybe his friends would find it interesting. But what happened next was beyond anything he could have imagined. The video started getting views immediately. People shared it with their friends and family. The video spread from person to person like wildfire. By the next morning, it had been viewed 10,000 times. By the afternoon, it had been viewed 100,000 times. By the end of the week, it had been viewed over 1 million times. Margaret did not know about any of this at first. She woke up the next morning and went to breakfast just like always. But she noticed that people were looking at her differently. The other residents were smiling at her and saying hello. Staff members were being extra friendly. Margaret wondered what was going on. Jenny came to find Margaret after breakfast and told her that she had some exciting news. She explained that the video of Margaret playing piano had become very popular on the internet. People all over the world were watching it and sharing it with their friends. Margaret was becoming famous. Margaret did not understand what being famous meant. She had never used a computer or looked at social media. Jenny showed her the video on her phone, and Margaret was surprised to see herself playing piano. She looked different in the video. She looked happy and alive and much younger than her age. The phone calls started coming to Sunset Gardens that same day. Reporters from newspapers wanted to interview Margaret. Television stations wanted to come and film her. Music schools wanted to invite her to give concerts. Everyone wanted to know more about the amazing grandmother who could play piano like a professional. Margaret felt overwhelmed by all the attention. She had lived a quiet life for so many years, and now suddenly everyone wanted to talk to her. Jenny helped her understand what was happening and asked if she wanted to do interviews. Margaret was nervous but also excited. She decided to say yes. The first television interview was with a local news station. The reporter came to Sunset Gardens and asked Margaret to tell her story. Margaret talked about growing up in Shanghai and learning to play piano as a child. She talked about coming to America and having to give up music to support her family. She talked about not playing piano. For 40 years, the reporter was amazed by Margaret's story. She asked Margaret to play something for the camera. Margaret sat down at the piano and played a beautiful piece by Chopin. The reporter and the camera crew were stunned by how well she played. The interview was broadcast that evening, and even more people saw Margaret's story. More interviews followed. Margaret was on national television and in newspapers across the country. People were fascinated by her story of hidden talent and second chances. Margaret became a symbol of hope for people who had given up on their dreams. She showed that it was never too late to rediscover your passion. A famous music school in New York called and invited Margaret to come and give a master class. They wanted her to teach young piano students and share her knowledge. Margaret was scared to travel so far, but she decided to try. She flew to New York and gave her first piano lesson in over 50 years. The young students were amazed by Margaret's teaching. She showed them techniques that she had learned from her teachers in Shanghai. She helped them understand how to put emotion into their playing. The students said she was the best teacher they had ever had. Margaret felt joy in sharing her knowledge with the next generation. Record companies started calling and asking Margaret if she wanted to make an album. She had never thought about recording music, but the idea excited her. She decided to record an album of her favorite pieces. The album was called Never Too Late, and it became very popular. People bought it to remember that dreams can come true at any age. Margaret's life at Sunset Gardens changed completely. She started giving concerts every week for the residents and their families. People came from all over the city to hear her play. The concerts brought joy to everyone who attended them. Margaret felt useful and happy for the first time in many years. She also started teaching piano to some of the staff members' children. Margaret loved working with young people and watching them learn to love music. She taught them the same way her teachers had taught her in Shanghai. The children adored her and called her Grandma Margaret. Margaret's own children were amazed by what had happened to their mother. They had always known she used to play piano, but they had never heard her play like this. Her daughter Sarah cried when she watched the video online. She was proud of her mother and sorry that she had not encouraged her to play piano again sooner. Margaret realized that her life had been divided into two parts. The first part was before she gave up music, and the second part was after she found it again. She was grateful for both parts because they had made her who she was. The struggles and sacrifices had given her strength and wisdom. The music had given her joy and purpose. At 92 years old, Margaret had learned that it was never too late to follow your dreams. She had shown the world that talent does not disappear with age. It just waits patiently for the right moment to shine again. Margaret's story inspired millions of people to never give up on the things they loved. She had become proof that beautiful things can happen when you least expect them.